Yeah, as Peter already pointed out, I want to talk today about challenges that vocational education and training is facing in the service and knowledge economy, and how these systems are adapting to these challenges. And in this context, I want to compare trajectories of change in two countries that I've also studied in recent years, Switzerland and Germany. So we had really great keynotes already, and all of them, I think, somehow touched upon also this topic of the rise of the knowledge economy. And yeah, what do I mean when I refer to this development? So we can think here of processes of deindustrialization, or also the digitalization and automation of the world of work, which is greatly accelerated by the current corona pandemic. There's also an increasing global competition for talent. And one could maybe say that these kind of challenges also feed another challenge for vocational education and training, and that is some academization pressure, given that there is some rising demand for more academic skills, and that's something that also vocational education and training systems are dealing with right now as a challenge. So as a starting point, I want to propose that vocational education and training systems face three challenges. These are three challenges that I want to focus on today as we see the rise of the service and knowledge economy. The first one is that arguably this rise of the service and knowledge economy requires a reconfiguration of the relationship between vocational training and general and higher education. This is to some extent pushed by young people, oftentimes opting now for more academic pathways. It's also pushed by European educational policies that to some extent also demand more permeability between vocational training and higher education. You can think, for example, of developments around the European and national qualification frameworks in this regard. There is a second challenge that I want to also talk about today, and that is the challenge to keep up or to maintain the inclusiveness capacity of vocational education and training systems. So as skills demands are rising, there is also this risk that some people are struggling even more to access regular vocational education and training programs. So this is also something that vocational education and training systems are in the process of dealing with as a challenge. And a third main challenge for me relates to reforms in the governance of vocational education and training. Now, especially in countries like Switzerland and Germany, we see that vocational education and training is governed by a multiplicity of private and public actors who cooperate often in a decentralized way in different regions, at different levels, governance levels, in different sectors or in different occupational fields. And oftentimes these actors do not have exactly the same interests. So as these skill formation systems face these challenges, such as the first two I just mentioned, it could well be that it's necessary also for them to find new ways to cooperate with each other to find solutions to these challenges. Okay, and then in more empirical terms, what the starting point for me was when I started to look at these two countries, or what I observed when I started to look at the two countries, is that it seemed to me that the way that Switzerland and Germany and actors in these systems respond to such challenges, that it somehow seems to be connected to different pathways of change. And I want to give you a preview here, but then I will dive into this in more detail later. So it seemed to me then, when I started to observe this, that in the Swiss case, we see that as the system, so to say, and actors in the system adjust to these challenges, we see transformations that affect and change to some extent the institutional core of vocational education and training, by which for now I would refer to, for example, to dual apprenticeship training at the secondary level and the institutions that make up this system of dual apprenticeship training at the secondary level. That's a key example of the institutional core of vocational education and training for me today. Whereas in the German case, it seems to me that we also see changes and innovations. And to some extent, they take also place within the institutional core. But it seems to me, or it seemed to me, that they occur more dominantly actually as innovations or changes that happen to some extent at the margins or outside of this institutional core, for example, of dual apprenticeship training at the secondary level. So I will provide some concrete examples later on, but I hope this gives you a little bit of an overview of this puzzle that I was facing and that I want to address today. More concretely then, my research questions are the following. How has vocational education and training in these two countries, Germany and Switzerland, developed in the context of the rising knowledge and service economy? And what kind of factors may explain these respective developments? It will be maybe no surprise if I argue that the Swiss and the German case, at least in international comparison, represent rather similar systems when it comes, for example, not only to the role that apprenticeship training plays in these skill formation systems, but also when we look at the governance of these systems. And it has been well established that both of them are collectively governed skill formation systems, and in which we see this strong role for private actors, for employer associations, unions, and the state in governing these systems. For today, I want to, however, also highlight one difference between these countries, and that is country size. So if you look at country size in terms of geographic size or in terms of inhabitants, then Germany is, very roughly speaking, about 9 times larger than Switzerland. And I want to argue today that that has some impact on the way that the respective collective skill formation systems react to the challenges they face as we see the rise of the service and knowledge economy. And to build that argument, I want to combine the theory of institutional change, for which scholars such as Catherine Thean, James Mahoney, Wolfgang Streeck are known, with that of small state corporatism, which has been famously originally developed by Peter Katzenstein. Okay, so let me then dive immediately into the theoretical part. And let me, in the first part of my theoretical considerations, talk about the theory of institutional change. And I want to start by highlighting that I adopt here a rather dynamic understanding of institutions. So regulative, normative, cultural, cognitive dimensions of institutions, they provide stability to social, economic, cultural life. But at the same time, they also entail a dynamic element. That is, they are not only constraining, but they can also enable actors to carry out reforms and changes at the same time. And I hope I can, elaborate that a bit further with this next slide, in which I want to focus on 2 key concepts in that theory of institutional change. That is path dependence and also gradual institutional change. So what we know from the literature and great studies by various people in the field is that we have a situation that in these collectively governed, multi-actor, decentralized skill formation systems, such as the Swiss or German one, we have a tendency towards strong path dependence. What do I mean by path dependence? So maybe you can imagine you want to climb up this tree here, and then at some point you will have to make a decision whether you follow one or the other branch, and then you climb up further, and then you will have to take another decision whether you take the one or the other branch. And at some point, it might get actually difficult to switch the branch completely or switch the path completely, because you would have to climb down. That might take time. That might also be a bit risky to climb backwards. So there is some sort of path dependency there. But there is also still the possibility, to carry out some changes, because as you keep climbing on that branch, you still face further options, right? You can still decide whether in the next decision you go one or the other way. And that's a little bit an image for this, for this idea of path dependency, but also the possibility of change still being there. However, it's likely to be rather a form of gradual change, incremental change, than some form of immediate, transformative, or radical change. So I expect that as these two countries adjust to these challenges, we see rather some gradual change than a more radical change. What historical institutionalists in this field have also done in recent years is that they have also, they went a step further and they developed ideas about specific modes of gradual institutional change. So different forms of how this kind of gradual change can take place or can unfold. The first one is displacement, and this refers to a situation where existing institutions, for example, the ones that are, institutionalizing the system of apprenticeship training, are gradually removed and new ones are gradually introduced. A second mode is layering, and here, instead of replacing existing institutions, actually new institutions are added on top of existing ones. And I will provide some more concrete examples in a second. The third mode is conversion. And here the idea is that institutions formally stay the same, but actors start to interpret and enact them in a different way. And finally, we have drift. And this can happen if you see shifts occurring in the external conditions or in the environment of an institution, but actors in that system, they are kind of neglecting these changes in the environment. And this implies that formally institution stays the same, but its impact changes as it does not get adjusted to these changes in the environment. Now, I want to say two things. First, in the following, I will say more about layering and conversion, because as it turns out, these are the most relevant ones for the two cases I look at today. And that's also because of limited time, I will focus mainly on these two. And I will also, in the next step, try to say more about what the kind of conditions are under which you would expect one or the other mode of gradual change to occur. And here, historical institutionalists have thought about two dimensions. And the first dimension is the characteristics of the political context, which can be characterized by rather strong or rather weak veto possibilities. And the second dimension refers to characteristics of the targeted institution. And this is about whether there's rather low or rather high level in terms of how that institution can be flexibly interpreted. So that's about the level of discretion and interpretation and enforcement of an institution. So if we indeed take the example of layering, then if we have a context where, for example, in an apprenticeship training system, there are strong veto possibilities by opponents to a certain change. And there's also rather limited capacity to flexibly interpret these kind of institutions that make up that system of apprenticeship training, then it's pretty difficult to carry out changes directly within the institution core that makes up apprenticeship training. However, what change agents might then try to still do is to develop new institutions on top of that institutional core that makes up dual apprenticeship training. For example, by developing institutions that then create new educational programs outside of this core of apprenticeship training. The second mode I want to elaborate a bit further is that of conversion. And it's quite the opposite case of that of layering. So when we have rather weak veto possibilities by opponents to the change and a rather high level of discretion in the interpretation of that institution, then change agents might actually be in a position to, that's the easiest option for them if they want to achieve some change, to kind of let the institution formally stay the same, but interpret it in a new way. And that would refer to conversion. Okay, so that was the first part of the theoretical framework. And now I want to add the second part, which is the theory of small state corporatism. And I want to do this because I argue that small state corporatism can now inform me about what kind of contextual conditions for gradual change we actually can find in the Swiss and in the German case. So I want to talk a bit about small state corporatism. Here, Peter Katzenstein and others have argued that in smaller and especially smaller corporate states that are internationally oriented in terms of their economies, that are export oriented, over time, actors in these systems have learned that they all do better if they work in terms of a consensus-based politics. So if you contrast this to a, let's say, larger market economy, there the domestic market is larger, which somehow shields that country a bit more from changes in the global market, could also be technological changes and so on. Whereas in smaller systems that are export oriented, there's a higher pressure to actually work together to find solutions to these global challenges. And this argument has been made by Peter Katzenstein, looking at Austria, Belgium, Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland, but obviously for today, Switzerland is the most relevant case. And what it implies is that there's a tendency that internal differences are typically overcome rather through some form of continuous negotiation and bargaining between the organized interest groups in that country rather than majority decision making. And let me stress that this argument, I think it makes more sense if you don't think about it in absolute terms, but in relative terms. So compared now to, let's say, the German case of a larger corporatist country. But what it implies for a smaller corporatist country is that, well, I can expect that there are actually fewer actors that act as strong veto players in reform processes compared to a larger country or larger corporatist country. And beyond that, I would argue that we can also derive from that theory that there is, in a way, also a bit more of a level of discretion in the flexible interpretation of institutions. So maybe you can think about it in these terms, that in a complex governance system where actors have the possibility to get to know each other better, to meet more frequently, to build up, in that sense, also kind of higher level of trust, it also becomes maybe possible to kind of work sometimes without very, very strong formalized processes, because you can find also the solutions in a kind of more flexible way. And well, maybe I can convince you more if I contrast that a bit with the German case, where I would argue that veto options are more pronounced and that this also can render political decision-making processes more prone to conflict. Also, I would argue that in the German case, there is, so to say, a more rigid institutionalization of the powers and roles of actors in the governance system. And this can also limit the scope for the kind of flexible interpretation of institutions. And I want to give an example. So if we look at the governance system of VET in the German case, then at the national level, at the state levels, and even at the level of the regional chambers, we have these VET governance boards, where next to state actors, we have the union side and we have the employer side represented with an equal number of people, right? And that's a formally institutionalized setup that also gives an opponent to a change quite a strong veto possibility, because in that board, they can try to, or they can actually veto a proposal. Okay, so with that, it's now possible for me to combine what I said earlier about modes of gradual change with the theory of small state corporatism. So you can see now the same table that I showed to you before, but now I kind of can load this table with the information I just got from the theory of small state corporatism. So if it's the case that veto possibilities are smaller in the Swiss case and the level of discretion is higher in the Swiss case, then it's likely that conversion is the more dominant mode of change as the Swiss vocational education and training system adjusts to challenges posed by the service and knowledge economy. Whereas what I could also derive from these theoretical considerations is that veto possibilities are stronger in the German case, and the level of discretion, the level of flexible, in which institutions can more flexibly be integrated, is a bit lower in the German case. And this would lead me to this expectation that layering is likely to be the more dominant mode of change, gradual change, as the German vocational education and training system adjusts to these challenges. I also want to visualize this by going back to a picture I showed to you earlier, but now I've added that, well, conversion for me is the type of gradual change that I expect to see in the Swiss case, and which leads to a gradual transformation within the institutional core of vocational education and training in the Swiss case. Whereas in the German case, I expect that we see more of a kind of layering where gradual innovations and changes take place more often outside of that at institutional core, for example, thinking about dual apprenticeship training at the secondary level. Okay, now I want to, in the next step, quickly tell you about my methods and data, and then finally dive into the actual empirical analysis and comparison. So you may have guessed by now that what I'm doing here is a historical institutionalist analysis, which starts roughly in the late 1960s. And I try to bring the discussion more or less up to the present day, to some extent at least. This is based on process tracing. Of course, this is based on a review of the available secondary literature. And here I'm standing on the shoulder of giants of scholars who have done great work on the German case, on the Swiss case. So several of these are also in this virtual room potentially. And in addition to that, I carried out, of course, my own empirical analysis based on expert interviews and document analysis in both countries. Here, I also rely in part on two databases. One is the GovPad database on the Organizations of the World of Work. GovPad stands for the leading house on governance of vocational and professional education and training that maybe some of you have already heard about. And I was based in that leading house for 2 years, from 2015 to 2017. It was really great to work in St. Gallen in Switzerland, and there with colleagues, we built up this database on the Organizations of the World of Work. And that's something I will refer to a bit later. And also in Berlin now, we are building up a database on the alliances for initial and further training that exist at the national level in Germany, but also at in each of the 16 states of Germany, there is an alliance of this kind. More about that in a minute. Okay, so my strategy now is that I want to compare central developments in these two countries, and I want to focus and go back to these 3 challenges I outlined earlier. And the first one was the reconfiguration of the relationship between vocational training and higher education. And the central development I want to focus on here for the Swiss case is that of the development of the vocational baccalaureate and the Universities of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. And I want to contrast this to a central development in the German case, which is that of the emergence and the development of dual study programs. Okay, so let me dive a bit deeper into these 2 key developments. What we see is that in Switzerland in the mid-1990s, there is a conversion process going on in the sense that former higher schools of vocational education and training get, not all of them, but a selection of them, they get transformed into universities of applied sciences that previously did not exist in the Swiss case. And at the same time, some of the vocational schools, they now get converted in a sense that they now offer vocational baccalaureate that can grant apprentices direct access to these Universities of Applied Sciences. And it's actually designed in a way that, as many of you will know, that this vocational baccalaureate is the royal pathway to access these Universities of Applied Sciences. So one can argue, I think, that this implies some gradual conversion of the vocational education and training system so that it now entails a systematic bridge to this academic world in the form of the Universities of Applied Sciences. Interestingly, this development was to some extent also pushed by international developments. So for example, at the time, OECD reports proposing that the proportion of higher education graduates in the Swiss case should maybe increase. Also, there is skilled migration as a factor. So as workers come to Switzerland and oftentimes come with higher education degrees, that also has exerted some pressure for, so to say, an academization process in the Swiss case. And that internationalization pressure, I want to also mention because it also relates to this argument in small state corporatism that these international pressures can also matter for these kind of gradual change processes. But let me contrast this now with the case of the dual study programs in the German case. So dual study programs are, to put it in simple terms, apprenticeship training programs, but at the higher education level. the vocational school has been replaced by a higher education organization that can be a vocational academy or University of Applied Science, sometimes even a university. And there are these two places of learning, the workplace and the seminar room. However, when we look at the development of these dual study programs, it's interesting to observe that initially around the 1970s, especially larger employers, they wanted to see some changes in the traditional core of dual apprenticeship training. However, these were blocked by opponents to that change, smaller firms and also unions. And then what these larger firms, as the key change agents in this case, did is that they started to develop and to cooperate with vocational academies to develop these dual study programs. But this development is happening outside of this institutional frame of dual apprenticeship training at the secondary level, and it's growing has been growing quite rapidly ever since. So we see that this emergence of the dual study programs is coming out of a situation where it was not easy for the change agent to carry out that change within the institutional core of dual apprenticeship training. Whereas this process I just described in the Swiss case, generally speaking, I would argue it was a more consensual process in which the different actors, at least compared to the German case, were more on board in terms of how they developed this reconfiguration of the relationship between vocational training and higher education. I'm happy to discuss this further, but for now, I would like to move on to my second challenge related to the rise of the service and knowledge economy, and that was the inclusiveness or maintaining this inclusiveness capacity of vocational education and training. Here, I want to, for the Swiss case, highlight this example of the federal vocational certificate. And for the German case, I want to look at the transition system. So again, I will dive a bit into the details of the respective developments. But first of all, what is the federal vocational certificate? The federal vocational certificate is a 2-year apprenticeship program that is also flanked by some supporting measures in case apprentices can benefit from such measures to actually successfully complete the apprenticeship. So it's targeted to some extent also at students who might struggle to complete a 3 to 4 year program. The way that these 2-year apprenticeship programs develop, my interpretation of that would be that you can see this as a conversion of the previous pre-training or the pre-existing pre-training programs that already were there, but they were more individualized. They were not standardized at a national level. And so there was a process that was, I would argue, pushed by the state, but it was then possible to get the unions and to get the employers on board and to develop these 2-year programs in the early 2000s then in a rather consensual way, at least if we compare this again with the German case. And let me start to mention that in the German case, we also have 2-year apprenticeship programs. And interestingly, at around the same time in the early 2000s, there was also a push to expand these, not so much to reform them, but to expand them. And it was a push by rather the larger employers. But in the German case, actually, the unions were opposing that. And they were fearing that the larger employers would use these 2-year apprenticeships maybe to develop more firm-specific, cheaper training options. However, it's interesting maybe to observe that actually at that point in time, the consensus principle in Germany was broken because the Ministry of Economics at the time sided with the employers and actually in around 2003 then decided to introduce around 12 new short-track training programs and to overhaul some of the pre-existing ones. And so once again, you can see it's a more conflictual process, but also one where, because unions are not really convinced by these 2-year short-track programs in Germany, I would argue it's also not really the most successful policy. I wanted to also talk about the transition system, because for the German case, when we look at the inclusiveness function, I think the transition system is an even more important maybe example than the 2-year apprenticeship programs. So this transition system it's a system for people who do not gain access to regular vocational education and training. So they more or less end up in this kind of buffer or waiting loop, right? And then there's a hope that after, let's say, 1 year, they manage to get access. But what I would like to argue is that this kind of transition system, it can be understood in a way also as a layer, right? Because it's something that this transition system and its expansion, its development, it doesn't require a change in the institutional core of dual apprenticeship training to maybe change that in a way that it actually manages to take up more of these students, but it's something that takes off some reform pressure of the core of dual apprenticeship training in the German case. So once again, I would argue that when we look at these key developments for the Swiss and the German case, we see rather a conversion process around gradual changes that affect the actual institutional core of apprenticeship training in the Swiss case. And we see a bit more of a trend towards also innovations, but in this case, innovations that are rather happening a little bit outside of the institutional core of dual apprenticeship training. Which brings me to my third challenge I was highlighting already earlier, and that's governance reforms. And here, I've alluded to this already earlier. For the Swiss case, I want to talk about the organizations of the world of work. And for the German case, I want to look at the alliances for initial and further training as representative for key developments in these two countries when it comes to governance reforms. Let me start by talking about the organizations of the world of work. These are organizations, and many of you will be experts on this, that are in charge of organizing occupational training in Switzerland. And the interesting part here is that there was a reform that was then really taking off also in the early 2000s, where these organizations of the world of work were set up in a new way, not least because there was the intention to integrate the health and care sectors, which were previously organized more by full-time vocational schooling, into apprenticeship training. And in these sectors, it was also necessary to actually create an organizational form to bring the stakeholders relevant for the governance of apprenticeship training actually together, because that wasn't existing in the same way in these sectors as they were previously organized more in terms of full-time vocational schooling. So, well, in more general terms, we see that this reform around the organizations of the world of work that are in charge of organizing apprenticeships and developing curricula and so on, that it was introducing a level of flexibility or increasing a level of flexibility in terms of how the actors can coordinate around changes in apprenticeship training. One could argue that this was in fact a state-led conversion process because the state played a key role in promoting these kind of changes, but then also giving the stage back to the private actors. And actually, when it comes to the implementation of the reform or the actual organization of the occupational training programs, the state also steps back again to some extent. I think it's interesting to contrast this with the developments around the Alliance for Initial and Further Training in the German case. But let me start again a little bit with the kind of historical trajectory. So again, we are talking about a similar point in time. So around the 2000s, there was in Germany, there was this problem that there were not enough apprenticeship offers. The unions proposed that there should be the introduction of an apprenticeship levy, so that firms should pay a levy, and that would support offering apprenticeship places. However, that initiative failed because employers were not happy with that proposal. But there was still a clear policy problem because there was a lack of apprenticeship offers for young people. So what the state did kind of instead is to start an initiative and to develop the national training pacts, bringing employer representatives on board and nudging them to actually offer more training places and to think about reforms in apprenticeship training. This was then transformed in 2014. These pacts were transformed into the Alliance for Initial and Further Training, in which then the unions also got a strong role in that alliance. And then more recently, in 2019, we also see the development of the National Skills Strategy, which is also this kind of governance platform that brings together relevant actors to think about reforms in vocational education and training, also in further education and training, and in particular to also improve the demand and supply conditions on the apprenticeship or training market. The point I want to stress here is that the developments around the National Pact and then the Alliance for Initial and Further Training and the National Skills Strategy, I would interpret them as something that happens on top of and in addition to the governance structures, the traditional governance structures that were and that still are in place. So the governance boards at the national, state, and at the local chamber levels, they are still in place, they're still operating, they are still the officially, the boards that are officially in charge. But with these alliances, there has been a new construct being put up there to, in a way, develop reforms, develop pilot projects, but to some extent, it's a layer, right? Because it's something that is developed on top. And I would argue to some extent that's necessary because the pre-existing traditional governance structures, apparently they were not capable to fully cope with these kind of challenges that the training system is facing. Okay, so I want to provide now, come back to the overview. And I was talking about the three governance challenges. I was talking about three key developments respectively. And what this leads me to overall is the conclusion that there is a tendency, at least, I would argue, for different pathways of change in the Swiss and in the German case. Of course, this is a stylized picture here, and you will find exceptions, but I'm very interested to hear what you think about this. Well, but what I then would conclude is that this trend or this more dominant pathway of change as the Swiss training system is adjusting to the service and knowledge economy is conversion. And this refers to incremental innovations that are unfolding within the core system of vocational education and training. At least I think that can be argued if you compare this to the larger corporatist country of Germany, where I find more of these layering processes, that is incremental innovations that take place rather at the margins of the core VET system. And this would then support the argument or fit with this theoretical argument that I have built up earlier, that country size or size of the corporatist system can be one determining factor for which kind of pathway of change we are likely to observe. And while I don't have time to go into this in detail, I had the opportunity also to do some research on the Luxembourgish case, for example, or the Danish case, so other European small corporatist countries. And for example, in the Luxembourgish case, I was quite impressed by the capacity of that state to bring together, for example, different institutional innovations or elements of neighboring skill formation systems and integrate them by processes of conversion into their own skill formation system. So I would argue that it would be interesting to try to extend the analysis and look at this argument of country size mattering for the type of change observed and look at further countries. So maybe I have the opportunity to do that in the future. Let's see. Now, in terms of discussing these kind of findings, I think that this conversion trajectory, it appears to support the sustainability of collective skill formation more directly. Why is this? Again, maybe this is possible to illustrate by comparing it to the other finding here, namely that of layering as the other pathway of change that is more dominant in the German case. And layering, well, it also leads to innovations. And these dual study programs, for example, in the German case, they clearly are an innovation and they also serve interests of certain actors for sure. There's one problem here, and that is that these processes of layering, they can also lead to a process, or they do lead to a process of differentiation. And by that, they increase also the complexity within the educational system overall. So you now have, kind of two options or more than two options even, rather than reforming the one option so that it kind of serves the, faces or can deal with the challenges, for example, in the context of the rise of the service and knowledge economy. So we find to some extent with layering a bit of a more limited systematization, some lack of transparency, some maybe also lack of permeability. And this can lead to frictions, right? So for example, frictions between the transition system, this kind of waiting loop, which is not really so successful in making sure that the people who are in that waiting loop actually then do get access to regular vocational education and training. Also, this increased differentiation, I would argue it's complicating orientation within the educational system. And this can be especially problematic for disadvantaged young people who may not have the same access to resources about which educational pathway to choose. So a more complex differentiated system in that sense can also have implications for social inequality. Layering, it does take off some of the reform pressure of that institutional core, right? Because change agents, they kind of found other ways to achieve to some extent what they wanted, the change that they wanted to see. There is, however, a long-term risk with this layering pathway that as the traditional institutional core, in this case, around apprenticeship training, maybe does not get adequately adjusted to these changes in the environment, in the longer run, there is a possibility that that means that it's kind of losing significance. It's losing value, the traditional core, because it's maybe not adjusted to the challenges to the extent that it might be necessary for it to be sustainable in the long run. So for example, if more and more students at the higher end of the skills distribution opt for dual study programs, which grant them a bachelor's degree plus the vocational training part, rather than entering the higher end apprenticeship training programs at the secondary level, then over time, that may pose a challenge, an additional challenge to traditional apprenticeship training at the secondary level. I'm coming to my last slide, which is an outlook slide. And I want to try to broaden a little bit the perspective and talk about what this might imply for change agents in VET reforms a bit more generally. So I think what is well established is that if a change agent wants to carry out a change in the VET system, that it's crucial to take into account the specific institutional context in which that change is supposed to unfold. What I would like to stress with today's presentation is that it can also be helpful to think beyond thinking about the institutional context, to also maybe try to identify what maybe the dominant or the dominant trajectories of change are in a specific institutional context, because this can provide the change agent with additional information about how a policy, a change can be carried out successfully. So, well, that would be the argument that awareness of this dominant trajectory of change or pathway of change can increase the likelihood that a change, a policy can be implemented successfully. To look at this the other way around, in case a change strategy falls rather outside the scope of a relevant pathway of change in a specific context, then maybe being aware of that is helping to, in a way, fine-tune that policy, that strategy of change, maybe flank it with some supporting measures so that it becomes more likely to be implemented sustainably in that specific context. Now, I'm very much looking forward to any comments, critical comments, questions that you may have. There are a couple of references. I'm happy to share these. If you are interested, just send me an email. And I thank you very much for your attention.